Thanks for that, Ray. So my name's Ryan Murphy, and I oversee the global behavioral insights efforts for Morningstar. In our behavioral science team, we study how people make decisions about risk and money and try and apply that to help people make better decisions. So what I want to talk to you about today is a piece of research we've been working on and asking about the right questions to try and understand the challenges that people have with understanding and articulating their particular goals. So let me start by what is a very simple problem, at least for computers. And so this set of equations here outlines work that comes out of behavioral economics. And if you believe it or not, this has to do with the emotions and feelings people have of gains and losses. These are the kinds of mathematical models we use in experimental econ and finance to understand how people make decisions about risk and money. These are the sorts of problems that computers are exceptionally good at solving. A person can make, say, 100 choices, and then parameters can be estimated in less than a tenth of a second using these kinds of models. So this is the sort of thing that computers, AI, this is what they excel at. There are other problems that are not so simple for computers. So for example, asking why did a person do that, or how should I think about trade-offs, or what options will make me more fulfilled as a person. It turns out these are rather difficult, not so simple problems for computers. The question I want to focus on today is a question that is simple but not so easy itself, and that is what makes a portfolio good? And a lot of the research we do in the behavioral sciences starts to try and understand how to better match investors with investments, and a lot of it circles around this particular not so easy question. Now, if you've taken a class in Introductory Finance or Econ 101, there's an answer to this question. It's presented as follows. On the x-axis, you look at the volatility risk of a particular portfolio. On the y-axis, you look at the expected returns. And a portfolio is mapped somewhere within that Cartesian space, right? This might be giving some of you flashbacks to Econ 101. So if I tell you that there's this particular portfolio that has very low volatility risk and very high expected returns, what would you say? Well, you might be naturally skeptical of such a thing, right? This is an unbelievable investment opportunity, probably too good to be true. When we look at real portfolios from how markets work, a pattern starts to emerge and a shape, and that thing is called the efficient frontier. Portfolios are mapped in here, and the answer to the question, what makes a portfolio good, at least from the narrow vantage of efficiency, is anything near that line, that boundary condition right there. In order to help a person choose what they should invest in, you need to know what their utility maximizing risk aversion coefficient is. You put that into the equation, run through the optimization, it tells you the answer. And that's what makes a portfolio good, right? This, I think, is part of the answer to a question, but I don't think it really answers the total question. I think this is about efficiency, which is necessary, but is not sufficient to help people make good decisions. And there's other things we need to take consideration of as well when building good portfolios for people. The second point I would argue that makes a portfolio good is effectiveness. And namely, is this portfolio getting a person where they want to go? And to quote the great thinker Yogi Berra, if you don't know where you're going, you might not get there. But part of the challenge then is helping people understand what their goals are, and we'll get to that in a moment. I think there's other aspects of quality of a portfolio in durability, and this is the sort of portfolio that an investor can stick with over the long run, and that I think is necessary. A plan isn't any good if a person can't stick with it. And lastly, there's been a lot of interest in the industry in the last years around ESG and the ethics of investing. And this, I think, is an optional vantage point, but again, for some people is really important to understand the degree to which an investor cares to have their personal or non-pecuniary preferences reflected in their investments. I think all of these things together weigh in to help us understand what makes a portfolio good. And as we give advice to people, these are the sorts of questions we have to grapple with. The research I want to talk to you about today focuses on this second point, effectiveness. How do we get the investor where they want to go? And that's this idea of goals. So a goal-centric investment planning approach is, in my view, probably the best way to think about what investing is and how to give good advice to people. And goals serve a lot of benefits. Goals provide a good benchmark to help people understand if they're on track or not. And goals provide a useful compared to what that market indexes don't. So for example, if a client is checking if their portfolio is doing well, they might be comparing it to, say, the S&P 500 or some other index. And that may not be what they really should be paying attention to. If you can reorient this process and help them understand if they're on track or not for their personal goals, then things should work better for them in the long run. We also know that if we can help focus people's attention on goals, this can be an antidote to return chasing and other kinds of bad behaviors that we see people fall prey to. This helps people counter the decision biases that can sometimes snag investors as they're investing. Goals are not necessarily cold or emotionless. Rather, goals can provide a very vivid, personal, sometimes emotionally grounded way for them to think about why they're investing. It helps people understand their motivation for investing. And there's a extensive line of research that comes out of academia by Locke and Latham provide the best summary of this, suggesting that people are much more committed to goals that are personalized, important to them, well specified, and realistic. And all of this together helps people endure and stay on track as they're investing. But we are not the first to point this out. And in fact, if you go back and look at the literature from, say, even the late 40s, Benjamin Graham is talking about the best way to measure investing success. And he's saying it's not by whether or not you're beating the market, but whether you've put in place a financial plan and a behavioral discipline that are likely to get you where you want to go. That's a goal-centric view, and I think that really articulates what we see as the best way to think about investing and advice. So back to this question I asked before. What makes a portfolio good? Well, in part, it helps investors reach their goals. Portfolios are just means to ends. So then naturally, as you're thinking about giving advice to clients, the question emerges, how do you ask people what their goals are? Well, you could just ask. Sit an investor down and just ask them what their overarching 30-year long-term financial goals are. It turns out that question is not so easy for people to answer. In many ways, that question is as foreign to them as the optimization problem I showed before. And it's not that people are lying or that they're trying to, mess up this process. Rather, people can be strangers to themselves. So asking people, what are your goals, is one of those easy questions that people often get wrong. So this kind of thing, this easy questions that people get wrong, has been a lot of what behavioral science has been focused on in the last decades, trying to find the ways in which people's general way of approaching and thinking can sometimes get snagged, fall into the sort of biases that we know well. One of the founders of the field was named Amos Tversky. He was part of the team that won the Nobel Prize for Behavioral Economics in the early 2000s. He was asked about AI, and he kind of cheekily responded. He said, it's not that we study natural or artificial intelligence. It's what we study is natural stupidity, the kinds of mistakes that people naturally make of their own. And out of that line of research, there's been a large body of the kind of predictably irrationalities that people make, the ways in which they make mistakes and the ways in which we can start to predict and understand why those things occur. I'll come back to this notion of how AI can help us through some of this and some of the ways it can and some of the ways that it may not be able to help so much. So one of the things that we did recently on our goal-centric investment planning research was showing how investors may not know their own overarching financial goals. And this can be a problem. It's an important thing. People should know what their goals are, but they don't always know such. So investment advisors are put in the unenviable position of having to talk to people about something that they should know, but that they don't know, and moreover, that they don't realize that they don't know. And that's part of what makes this problem pernicious, is that there's a lack of awareness of people just not seeing what they don't see. As part of this research, we introduced this three-step process, and this is one of the first studies of ours I'll talk about. So the three-step process is put at the end of this paper. And for this, we guide people through a process of articulating and in some ways discovering their own goals. So step one of this is you ask people just to start to mark out and list out what they think their overarching financial goals are. This is just taking pencil to paper, kind of a brainstorming approach, and it takes people about 3 to 4 minutes to start to fill this out. Let me zoom in there a little bit so you can see this. Again, this is just open-ended questions, an open sheet here, getting people starting to think about this. At the end of step one, you say, okay, thank you very much for doing that, dear client, set that aside. And now let's move on to the second step of this process. So step two is you say, here's a list of common goals that people might have. If you would just start to read through this list and mark off things on there that you find particularly motivating and interesting. If there's something on there that you're not interested at all or that doesn't appeal, scratch it off. And if you're indifferent, just kind of leave it there. So this takes people just a couple minutes to go through, going through reading these and evaluating them. Part of what we're doing here is a little bit of choice architecture, and we're giving a structure to help people think about what turns out to be a hard problem. And there's the evaluative process. People are evaluating whether or not they like something or not. And there's the generative process where they have to come up with things to evaluate, things they might have as goals. If you ask people just to start to name things, what could be goals that they like, they're having to do both of these cognitive processes at the same time. And it turns out this is hard to do. It's like trying to drive and text. So what we're doing in this process is disentangling those and giving people a chance to not have to generate, but be able to evaluate these different things and do so in isolation. So then the third step of the process, the person sets down the checklist and says, okay, now that you've gone through step one of just starting to brainstorm about this, and step two, the checklist, now let's start to write down what your overarching long-term financial goals are, right? So you can think of the first step of being a little bit of brainstorming, like just doing so in pencil. But by the time you get to step three, we're starting to put ink to paper, starting to be a little bit more definitive about what the goals are. None of this is carved in stone, of course. People's goals change, life evolves, there's lots of needs that start to emerge. And of course, this is a dynamic process. Now, if people were perfectly rational and knew themselves well, what they would write down in step one would be identical to what they'd write down in step three. So there'd be no process of change here, no discovery. But that's not what we find. We find that there's discord between the different steps here. About 25% of the answers people put in step one are fundamentally different than what they write down in step three. Not just that they change the wording a little bit, but that they're talking about a radically different goal. And if you look at the top three, we see about 76% of people are changing at least one of their top three goals in this process. Right, so there's a substantial amount of change here. So just to give a little bit more detail on this study, it's not as though I think people are trying to be deceptive or that they're trying to mislead, but rather they're starting to discover and understand themselves to become less strangers to themselves. Moreover, what we're doing here is a rather gentle way of nudging people to better understand themselves, rather than confronting them straight off and saying, hey, about 25% of the time, people don't even know what their overarching motivation is in investing. It's a more gentle approach to this. And people tend to find this kind of delightful, right? They tend to smile when they see that they've changed their mind or they have a positive emotional response by the time they get to the third step, like they better understand and can articulate what they're after. And that's also a really positive feature of this kind of process. So this research was published last year, couple of years, and has been used and has some degree of notoriety. And so this continues to come back as a topic for us. And so we revisited this line of research, trying to understand a little bit more about people's goals and digging deeper into this process. And so myself and other members of the behavioral science team started another research line and did this in collaboration with a wealth management firm in Canada. In this study, wealth manager and their clients were invited to join and participate in the research and talk about their financial goals. 310 investors joined, and they reported about 2,400 goals in total. This is not necessarily a nationally representative sample of Canada or the United States, but it tends to be a little bit younger on average. The respondents tended to be slightly wealthier, a little bit more financially literate, and there were a little bit more males in the sample than in the general population proportionally. Here's what we did in this study. Again, it's a three-step process, but it's different than we did before. So step one of this, the study design. We ask people to talk about what their goals are, just again, off the top of their heads, to talk about what their overarching financial goals are. And people type these things in. It takes them about 3 to 5 minutes or so. Then the second step of the study, what we do is we say, okay, tell me more. Is there anything you might have missed? Maybe start to think of some other things that you may not have mentioned yet, starting to push a little bit deeper. And then in the third step of the study, we say, okay, before we go on, let's consider a framework. Financial goals generally fit into the following categories, and then we delineate a set of categories, which I'll talk about in a moment. And after you've seen these categories and thought about this a little bit more, add any additional goals that come to mind and type those in. And again, this takes people about 3 to 5 minutes. The framework that we provide to people is something called PermaV, and this comes out of the positive psychology area, the psychology of happiness. A lot of psychology traditionally looked at disorders, people who were making bad choices and not very happy. The psychology of happiness movement started about 30 years ago as a response to that, to try and understand what are the positive things people can do and the things that make people happy and fulfilled. So Segelman is a leading researcher in this area. He's at the University of Pennsylvania. And this framework is something that he and his colleagues developed over the course of that research. So PermaV stands for the sorts of things that drive and contribute to a person's well-being and happiness: positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, accomplishment, and vitality. And so once you show people this framework, and this is what was done in step 3, and ask them to start to think about this a little bit, then they start to think about this as a lens and what their goals and motivations are. All right, so the study design here of the second study I'm talking about here is we ask this question, what are your goals? And then we ask it again, pushing to try and see if we can help people better understand and articulate what they're motivated by. And in the third step, we provide them a structure, and we use this framework and then see whether or not that has an impact on the kinds of things that they say. Now, if again, people are perfectly rational, none of this will matter. They'll know from step 1 exactly what they're motivated by, and steps 2 and 3 will be redundant. That's probably not going to be the case. One of the interesting conjectures is just by pushing, asking people again, tell me more, asking the same question again, whether or not that's sufficient to help people articulate what they're motivated by. We'll revisit that in a moment as a conjecture. All right, so this study, the data for this study turns out to be large piles of open text responses. So like I said, 310 people joined the study. They made about 2,400 responses and has about 25,000 words or so in the data set. And here's some examples of the things that people type and respond. I'm not going to read them all, but part of the reason I showed these to you is just to get some idea of how people are responding to these questions and the stimuli we're giving them. And moreover, to highlight that this is a different kind of data set than you might have seen before. It's not the sort of thing you can analyze in Excel. It's not like you can find the average of all these responses, right? So this is a much more difficult set of data to start to try and make sense of. That's where we were able to use and leverage some new technology from large language models and AI. So for this, we had the challenge of distilling all of these responses into something comprehensible. And there's two general approaches we used. One's called BERT topic, the other is called an LDA analysis. And for this collection of these responses is put into the algorithm, and the algo then helps identify the general themes and topic clusters that people mention when explaining their goals. In a way, we're using the AI to start to tease out and understand the structure of all of these responses. One of the things I like about this in particular is that researchers sometimes have hypotheses going into their studies, maybe even pet hypotheses, things that we want to be true. And as hard as we try, it's hard not to be biased sometimes. So what I like about this as an approach is that it removes a little bit of the human from this element and starts to categorize and understand the meaning of the data and the responses people make without being filtered through a lens of a researcher. And what we see that comes out of this is a structure. So the AI, the analysis, is starting to propose a structure that comes out of these responses. And so, for example, if someone types in budgeting enough to pay for a family trip of some kind every year between now and when my kids are off, this gets put in the category of traveling primarily, but also mentions family and relationships. So what we can do then is with these examples, categorize them, primary and secondary, of what they're joining or how they fit together. When we look across the data, these are the results we see. These are the overall percentages of the different categories of the goals by these different categories. So you see traveling, donating, healthy lifestyle, owning a home, small luxuries, and so on. This is interesting, but I think that one thing that makes this study particularly interesting is our ability to start to separate this out by the design we used, by asking people off the top of their heads what they're interested in, giving them a chance to go a little deeper, and then starting to give them frameworks to think about what their goals and motivations are. So let me separate the data out by the 3 steps of the study I showed you before and start to walk through this. So again, the top panel there is step 1. This is what happens if we just ask people what they're motivated by. Step 2 is when we push and ask again, trying to nudge them to go a little bit deeper. And step 3 is where we start to give them a framework, starting to think about what leads to happiness and fulfillment, this PERMA V framework. And then after they've seen that and thought about that, starting to reflect more and talk about what they're motivated by. So let me highlight a couple of the results that we see here. So for example, retirement. Retirement is top of mind for many people, and it's the first thing they mention when they talk about why they're investing and what their goals are. On step 2, people mention this some, but by step 3, they're not mentioning this anymore. And I don't think it's because it's not important or it goes away. In many ways, they've already answered this and set that off, and they're starting to move on to other things that might motivate them. We see a similar pattern when we talk about owning a home. This is one of the major reasons people are saving and investing. This is top of mind in what they mention. And by step 3, this isn't what they're focused on anymore. Feeling financially secure, similar kind of pattern. But there are other goals and motivations we see that have an opposite pattern. Say, for example, healthy lifestyle. So this is not mentioned very often, relatively in the first step. But by step 3, this becomes the most common thing that people are answering as to what one of their goals is in the research. That's interesting. It's as if people are starting to be reminded that their ability to enjoy the fruits of their labor into retirement is going to be predicated on their good health and well-being. And once they are reminded of this, then they start to say, oh, okay, that's one of my goals now today to make sure that I can do so. Also, things like time with loved ones starts to emerge more as a goal people have, as well as building and supporting the development of relationships. So we start to see some interesting patterns. Some things start off as important and then diminish their frequency of how often they're mentioned, and others vice versa. So what we saw when we looked at the data was that there were not big differences between the kinds of things that people said on steps 1 and steps 2. If anything, the kinds of things that people said on step 2 were less important or perhaps less grounded than the topics on either step 1 or step 3. What I take that to mean is that just asking people again, just nudging them, tell me more, isn't sufficient to get them to really give you deeper insights into what's motivating them. What we did see is that the use of the PERMA V framework had a significant effect on the topics that people mentioned. It also had an effect on the subsequent clarity and depth they provided when talking about what motivated them. What we saw in the pattern of results was that there was a transition from financial goals to something more like life goals. So we saw a dynamic emerge too, where people tended to start with the whats as they were talking about what motivated them, and then move more to the whys. So for example, and all of these are verbatim from the study, people will sometimes say retirement or something very simple. I'm saving and investing for retirement. That's fine, but it really doesn't give you deep insight into what's motivating them. If you give them a nudge, say, okay, tell me more, sometimes they do. But when you use something like the PERMA V framework, then they start to get into much more detail. I want to have more time too. And this is where it became open, very much idiosyncratic about what people were motivated by. Some people were saving and wanted to develop a small studio on their house to work on art. Others wanted to turn to music. And they were touching things too in the study, people talking about how they gave up their aspiration and joy of music for many decades so that they could have a career to support family, and how much they were looking forward to being able to return to that passion of theirs. Other things, like people would say things like pay off a mortgage, right, on step 1. But you give them a little bit more time and you give them a framework to think about, and they say things in more detail, like buy a cottage as a secondary home to become a retirement home. For financial advisors, that kind of detail is really useful as they're trying to understand and guide their clients in today, what the choices they're making today, as to how those have consequences for the long term. Other examples, so a person writes in the first step to be financially able to support a large family. And by step 3, it starts to get into a little bit more of the motivations, financially be able to derive a sense of accomplishment, eliteness, and respect from my wealth. And that's interesting. That's verbatim from this particular person as to what's motivating them. Lastly, lots of people say things like incidentals on the first step, which I'm not really sure what that means besides saying that they anticipate they'll have bills into the future. But by step 3, you'll see people type things like not to be a burden on my children. That's really interesting and insightful. And I think that as an advisor, there's probably a very worthwhile story to uncover there as to what this client went through and how that's going to change how they make decisions as they invest. So we have this notion that comes from academia called rational choice theory. And if you, like I was saying, if you look at economics textbooks, it says markets are populated by perfectly rational decision agents, which probably not the case, right? If people are perfectly rational decision agents, you just have to give them all the information and ask them their preferences and goals, and they'll be able to articulate exactly what those are. They know what they want, and they can explain that. It turns out that's not really what we see. And there's lots of evidence that comes out of behavioral economics that shows that people are sometimes a bit strangers to themselves. People are not perfectly rational, nor are they purely random either. There tends to be patterns to the kinds of ways in which people approach decisions and the kinds of mistakes that they might make. That structure is good because we can start to understand the kinds of predictable irrationalities that people have and then develop processes to help them make more rational choices in spite of the fact that they're simply bounded or limited. So the mantra that continues to come up repeatedly from experimental economics and behavioral finance is keep it simple, make it easy, ensure that it's relevant. And this echoes a lot of the points that other authors have talked about. For example, there's a great book called Nudge, written by Richard Thaler and Cass Susting, that talks a lot about how we can start to change the choice environment for people to help them make better decisions. So we're not here to teach people to be rational, but rather help them make choices that are closer to rational because of the structure we provide. The structure we provide can come out of the examples that I just showed. So for example, both of the studies I showed have a kind of choice architecture built inside of them. The first one was a set of checklists, right? A set of options that people can look over and evaluate what they like and what they don't like. It turns out checklists are really useful for helping people make better decisions. It can serve as a structure and a kind of way to aid memory that otherwise people might sometimes just overlook or forget. Checklists like this show examples of different goals, and this helps people identify and articulate their own what's better. And as they do that, as the what's become clearer to them more directly, the whys can then more naturally follow once there's clarity around the what's. And so from a standpoint of getting a better understanding, digging deeper into people's motivations, checklists like this can be valuable. The second intervention we had from the second study was this framework, the PERMA-V framework. And this meaning framework very quickly and very directly orients people toward their whys. And once they start to see those whys clearly, then they can be nudged to generate the whats. So this is a little bit more of a circuitous route, but I think it's a really useful tool for understanding what motivates people. So what should you do taking all this away? Well, what not to do? Don't just ask people the question, what are your overarching goals? Because that turns out to be a really difficult question that people struggle with. Rather than just ask, start to give structure to it. So there's this mining for goals checklist. This comes out of our research, which people are able to download and use in their own practices. In the United States, it went through FINRA review, which is a kind of regulatory body. So as part of the advice process, and that gives us an added degree of confidence for its use in practice. This, I think, is really powerful for helping people make better decisions and understand what motivates them. But I think that additionally, maybe once after the checklist is done and checking in with clients regularly, this idea of a framework for starting to think about where life satisfaction comes from, life goals, meaning, happiness, what it means to lead a virtuous life that's well lived. This kind of framework, I think, can be very useful for people as well to help them better understand and articulate themselves. So part of what I see emerging here is this metaphor of thinking about the levels of goals, the what's and the whys. The what's being a little bit closer to the surface, like an iceberg, but the whys being deep and much more substantial underneath. And a lot of the emotional power that can give people the discipline and endurance to invest over the duration comes from understanding those deep whys. So there's complication here, right? There's the complication of specificity and flexibility. We know that good goals are specific and measurable, but we also know that good plans are flexible and sometimes much more abstract. So let's consider a particular case here of a household that has the goal of owning a country cottage. That's their what. Why? Well, as it turns out, what they really want to do is find a relaxing place to gather generations of family, to have better connections, and really be part of their family's lives intergenerationally. So this household is starting to save and invest, hoping to accomplish these goals. The goal is to own a country cottage, but it's worth keeping in mind what the why is. because we don't know if in 15 to 20 years from now, future generations of family will be able to or be willing to gather at the country cottage as intended. They might have to move farther away for work, other sorts of things along those lines. And so this particular household may not be having the goal anymore of a country cottage, but rather a flat that's near where family is, something that looks very different than what they were thinking, but it's serving the same why. Predictions are hard, especially about the future, right? To quote Niels Bohr here. But as advisors, you're constantly helping people think about the kinds of predictions of what they want into the future and helping them be flexible to be able to achieve those long-term whys. But at the same time, there's power in the specificity of understanding that they're trying to invest for this particular cottage. That vision, that idea of the cottage can be very powerful in the now, even though in the long term, there's something more abstract that they're after. All right. So back to this very simple but not so easy question. What makes a portfolio good? I think this is a wickedly difficult question. I think it's wickedly difficult for computer programs in some ways. Some of it has math behind it that's straightforward for computers and algorithms to solve. But there's other parts and other components that go into answering this question that are exceedingly difficult. Moreover, they're exceedingly difficult for people to answer themselves. So when we think about efficiency, a lot of this is the mathematics of trade-offs, and a lot of that has been worked out, right? So that I don't think is a place where there's a lot of snags that could come out. It's this notion of effectiveness, of how do you help investors get where they want to go, and that goal centricity. And all of that's predicated on understanding people's goals and helping people understand and articulate their own goals. That turns out to be really hard. I think there's a lot of opportunity here for what AI can do. But I think that helping an individual discover what they want is not really a sentence completion problem. So a lot of the attention that AI has received in the last year or so in ChatGPT is around this idea of this generative process. And really what's going on behind the scenes there is the completion of sentences from knowledge corpuses that are looked at. So for example, if you think about the sentence, what is the capital of Spain is, if you read all of Wikipedia, there's a word that pops out of what should be the completion of that sentence, right? It's not London, it's Madrid. But that's a very different kind of problem of my overarching long-term financial goal is, right? And for that, that's idiosyncratic. It's very personal. It's about me, what my goals are. And there's no training corpus for this to understand how to give idiosyncratic goals-based advice. That's a different kind of problem. I also recognize that generative AI uses randomness in ways that may not be suitable when helping people understand their motivations, nor to render advice about what they should do with their life savings. So this is something that when we look at our particular modeling practices, when we do this large language modeling, we can run Monte Carlo simulations in that, essentially running these models lots of time and start to find answers that emerge to try and get rid of the effects of randomness or noise. And that I think is necessary as we're doing this process of trying to categorize what people's goals are. And that's something that's different than the way that ChatGPT works, for example, as it generates sentences in response to prompts. That's something I think it's interesting to start to think about, and something I'll need to be tuned as we use these AI systems to start to give people advice. All right, that's what I wanted to cover with you today. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I appreciate it, and go from there.